Hey, my name is Chris Bale. I'm a professor of Sociology and Public Policy at Duke University and the director of the Summer Institutes in Computational Social Science. And today I want to talk to you about how to publish an article in Computational Social Science. So welcome everybody. It's my pleasure today to try to tell you what I've learned about how to publish an article in Computational Social Science. So why should you listen to me? I've been doing this a while. I've been publishing papers in computational social science for about 15 years. I've served as an editor at a lot of the journals that publish computational social science. I used to be an editor at Science Advances. I've edited manuscripts for Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. I've served on the editorial board of a number of other academic journals in sociology and political science, and I've served as an anonymous reviewer for God knows how many manuscripts over the sort of 15 or so years that I've been doing this. So I've seen a lot. I've sort of seen how the field has changed a lot too, and so I want to pass along both some sort of concrete knowledge, sort of how-to stuff, but then also kind of work in some stuff that I think is specific to computational social science, some of the unique opportunities and challenges that people face in publishing in this area, and hopefully sort of strike a sweet spot between sort of fundamental knowledge and then again tailoring it to our field. Okay, so I just kind of went over all of what I have to offer. I want to also say that no single person trying to talk about this topic can really be authoritative. Our field, computational social science, is comprised of many different fields, so the way things work in economics journals could be very different than the way it works in, say, social psychology journals, and the way things work at a journal like Science are very different than the way things work at a journal like the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. So I'll try to go over some of those differences today, but I just want to give the sort of general caveat that there are exceptions to almost every rule in publishing, and my goal is not to chart sort of every single part of the publishing process, but to try to pull back the curtain a little bit and make things a little less opaque, and try to give you all the view from the other side, meaning what journal editors see, what reviewers see, and sort of pass along some tips that can help you anticipate possible objections people might have to your manuscript, or understand why what you're doing may or may not be working the way you want it to. So first I want to just go over, this is going to be sort of rudimentary. Probably a lot of people watching this sort of already know the broad strokes of how academic publishing works, but let's just look at this chart, and we're going to kind of work through each of these stages of publishing a paper. And we're just going to begin at the very beginning, when we're submitting the manuscript. But of course, there's a lot of stuff that goes into research before that manuscript is submitted, right? People have designed research, people have executed research, people have analyzed data, people have written many, many drafts of papers, people have shared them with others, people have talked about their ideas with others, and people have in many cases been reviewed by, say, grant or grant-making organizations in order to get to this place. So we're sort of not going to go into a ton of detail on that research process. You can check out a lot of other videos on 6 for learning how to design research studies. We're really concretely talking about publication. So we're assuming, in other words, that you've done the hard work of doing the research. It's definitely one of the hardest parts, but of course, it's only the beginning of producing the end product way down there in the lower right-hand corner of our screen, the actual publication that we all sort of see and read. Okay, so we've submitted our manuscript, and editors usually have some kind of queue. Now it can vary across journals. Some journals are run by a very small group of people, almost the entire journal. It could be as few as 2 or 3 people. Very large journals like Science may have hundreds of employees that work on processing manuscripts, publicizing them, and they may have kind of vast resources. They may even pay people to be editors, or they may even, in some unusual cases, even pay reviewers, so that's pretty rare. And I mention payment because the vast majority of the people doing this are doing it completely out of goodwill and completely for free. So I just want to say up front that being an editor or being an editorial board member is a pretty thankless job. When I was a junior scholar, I can remember sort of having a sort of like fundamentally antagonistic relationship with journals. Like, why don't they publish my stuff? Why do I keep getting rejected? And the more I sort of began to occupy the other side, the more I became sympathetic to editors who, like everyone else, right, are spending their precious time doing teaching, research, service, mentoring, fundraising, all the things that professors do. And now all of a sudden you get an email out of the blue and without any kind of anticipation that, hey, we'd like you to review this thing. Or if you're an editor, right, you don't know how many submissions you might get or how late you might stay up trying to find reviewers to find your manuscript. So just fundamentally remember that this is an entirely volunteer system. Science survives because of it. That's why we all contribute to it. But it helps, I think, to sort of assume the mental space of the editor, right? They're a very busy person who's already volunteering a lot of their time. And they're quite often, especially at journals that get a lot of submissions, overwhelmed. And don't have a lot of time to take as much care as we might like them to. So, many of us, in fact, I would say almost everyone has experienced a bench rejection. And that's sort of our next stage on our path to publication here. So the editor gets the manuscript. Journals vary a lot in how much information they require. And how much formatting they require. Some journals, like Nature Human Behavior, will let you submit pretty much in any format with sort of almost any, you could use Word, you could use LaTeX, the sort of formatting software. You could use all sorts of stuff. Others are extraordinarily specific. So Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, until recently, would require that you upload each and every single file, image file, and then compile it as a LaTeX file natively on their manuscript submission portal. And this could be a huge waste of your time, right? If you've done this before and if you've gotten rejected by a journal like this before, you may spend hours or maybe even a whole day meticulously formatting your journal article only to discover that the editor thinks it isn't a good fit. It's a horrible outcome, right? So I think you can sort of before you go through that, do some gut checks, talk to other people, mentors, advisors, colleagues, the SIX community. Do you think this is a good fit for this journal? But also, see if you can get some early drafts from those same people, colleagues, mentors, advisors, and see what like an early stage submission looks like. As an editor, again, you're overwhelmed by manuscripts. You have very limited time. If something doesn't just look like an article right away that would eventually appear in your journal, like let's say it's got an entirely foreign citation system in the field, or it looks like it doesn't have any actual empirical evidence and your journal only publishes empirical evidence, right? These are the most common reasons why something can get bench rejected at a journal. But at very, very prestigious journals, these are the Sciences, the PNASs, the Nature Human Behavior, Nature, and so on, they can get bench rejected for many, many other reasons. In fact, some brilliant research studies get bench rejected. And the reason that journals like this, that things get rejected, are that they might not be of interest to a broad enough audience. So these journals are designed and sort of read by, or in principle, like everyone, right? And so an editor who's seeing, working with a manuscript there is asking themselves, are huge numbers of people going to care about this, right? So you might have a really beautiful finding in a sort of niche area of social psychology, but someone might ask, yeah, but shouldn't this go to a social psychology journal? On top of that, these sort of large venues like Science, PNAS, Nature, they tend to sort of fetishize work that has public relevance. So if you were doing work on vaccine hesitation or something like that, or another common theme is sort of science of science, social studies of science. Those are sort of almost by definition going to have broad audiences because scientists care about reading about science. Everybody's experiencing the pandemic, so people want to hear about the latest and greatest solutions. That one cuts both ways, though, by the way. I can't tell you how many submissions we're seeing as editors on topics related to COVID. It's really been pretty overwhelming. And again, imagine yourself, very little time, you yourself, or maybe you've been watching your kids all day or homeschooling your kids early in the pandemic, and then a manuscript comes in at 10 p.m. and it's not in your field and you're not quite sure, right? Editors can be a little risk averse and just say, I don't know, I'm going to make the call that I should bench reject this. You might look at bench rejection as like a really bad outcome and say, oh man, it didn't even get reviewed. It must have been really bad. Again, the editor's busy, but the editor also might have your best interest in mind. One of the worst outcomes in publishing can be that you get reviewed and then maybe you even get an invitation to revise and resubmit, which we're getting to, and then you put a ton of work into the manuscript, and then ultimately it has some sort of really major issue that another reviewer identifies or another editor. Some of these journals have a hierarchical structure, right? So at PNAS, I might get invited to edit a manuscript, and then I make a recommendation to the editorial board, but it can still be rejected there, right? And so you can also think of a bench reject as sort of merciful. That might seem like really hard to do in an environment where publications are the coin of the realm and we're all trying to do it. Really what's important is that you want to have stuff under review constantly and as much as possible. And so to that end, because you're not going to publish unless stuff's under review, right? And I'm not saying like do the quickest study you can. I just mean having stuff continuously under review is a really good strategy. And means that you have to sort of get up quickly from rejections. We all get rejected, I think, I don't know if you all saw several years ago, there was like a CV of rejections, and this really clever, I think it was someone at Princeton in social psychology or psychology had listed like every article they didn't publish, every grant they didn't get, and it was just like, dozens of pages long. I would do that personally, but it would be even longer than dozens of pages long. Most, I think, successful people you'll find get rejected all the time. We just don't talk about it. And I like to be very forthright and honest and say, it's part of the process. So the sooner you can make the sort of psychological metamorphosis from, this is a negative outcome to me, to actually, this is part of the process. This is what all good computational social scientists go through. And it sucks, I'm going through it right now, but I gotta keep going. Okay, so let's say you've made it past the bench reject stage. And of course, the bar to getting reviewed at different journals varies tremendously. So getting reviewed at a place like Science or PNAS, you could think of as a major accomplishment in terms of you've written something that lots of people think may be of interest to the field. That itself is maybe of interest to a large group of people. That in itself is sort of an accomplishment. But other journals, there's many disciplinary journals that are very hard to publish in too. But if we go, further down the prestige rankings, and I'll show you the names of some of these journals and where people are publishing in computational social science in just a minute, we start to see that, bench rejects are less and less likely, and papers tend to get rejected, for other types of reasons. So it might not be the public relevance thing that would lead a Science or Nature editor to reject something. It might be more the fit with that specific journal. You've sent a paper about, using digital trace data to study international migration to a journal that studies ethnicity but not really migration, and that editor makes the call that, my audience just isn't really interested in that. That's not what we do, right? So if you've made it through this bench reject stage, you're under review, right? This is exciting. This can take a long time. Some journals are extraordinarily quick. So when you are asked to review an article for a place like PNAS or Science, you might get asked to return your review in a week. And now I asked you earlier to take the perspective of the editor, right? This really busy person who has this entirely thankless job, right? nobody kind of goes to an editor and says, hey, thanks for publishing my manuscript, that was great, No, they get, sort of lots of not so nice emails from people who feel like the wrong decision was made, or people who feel frustrated by a reviewer, right? It's a lot of negative. So again, that's the editor's job. Now let's take the reviewer's perspective for a second. Once again, you are a busy faculty member. You are doing your own research. You're doing your own teaching. You're doing your own service. You're doing all the other things that go on in life. And then again, in a very unpredictable way, you might get 1, 2, or maybe a dozen, or maybe even 2 dozen, depending on your career stage, review requests a week. And so again, you're pretty overwhelmed. You don't have a lot of time. You sort of have to pick and choose what you're going to review. And here again, reviewers can be less careful than we might like them to be. Ideally, right, reviewers would be a sort of like large community that helped us improve the science, right? That would be great. And if we could all get anonymous feedback that is really constructive and ultimately about helping us make our research better, right? Now, there are many, many generous people. In fact, it astounds me how generous reviewers can sometimes be in suggesting ways to improve the research. But it's really important for us all to remember that that is not the reviewer's job. The reviewer's job is to decide whether the research passes the bar, whether the empirical analysis is rigorous, whether it will be of interest to the audience of the journal, and so on and so forth, right? So the reason I mention that is, if you're used to sharing your work with, say, an advisor or colleagues, or maybe like, at a summer institute, people are trading papers and giving each other comments, that's all great. But that is a totally different style of feedback. Like, the reviewer is just, in the first few pages trying to see, does this pass a sniff test? Is it, again, is it in the style I would expect from the journal? Does it appear to have a serious analysis? They might be flipping back and forth between the tables and the results in the paper and the first few pages and trying to get a big picture sense of what's going on. As a reviewer, you might get, brilliant articles that are meticulously written and seem to shine right away, and then you might get many others. You just can't even figure out what the article is about. And that's a big problem, and one of the most common reasons why things get bench rejected or ultimately rejected is the author didn't do the very difficult job, which we'll talk about in just a minute, of sort of communicating, what is this article? Why is it important? What is it going to do for the field? How did I do it? Why should you trust me? Right? These are sort of basic questions that can be buried, so the worst thing you can do to a reviewer, in my opinion, is you have to remember this busy person who's all of a sudden got an email review. They thought they could go for a bike ride this afternoon. Oh, I just got a review request, right? Now I got to now my part of my weekend is gone, right? That's a choice, right? So they probably want to read the paper at some level or feel obligated, but they're busy, right? And so now let's imagine that person, and they get 3 pages into the manuscript, and they're thinking, what is this about? I don't even know how to evaluate it. There's claims being made that don't seem to be supported by the analysis. And if they don't get the sense that it is going to be a fine piece of research, they might not give your paper the attention you might want them to give. They're not reading it like your advisor who's going through and saying, you can't say this given your data, and they're just giving you their opinion, right? And so this can be really tough to hear, especially as a junior scholar, right? Often it comes off as just really, really brusque, right? Like, this paper has fatal issues, the analysis does not support, the claims, the data have problem X, Y, and Z, right? It's all just a lot of negative stuff. Sometimes you'll get a little bit of like, what I liked about this paper was X, Y, and Z, but it had these problems, right? But again, remember, this person is busy, they have very limited time. They're just going to tell you all the things that would need to be improved to make the manuscript publishable. They're not going to take the time to sort of give you what you as a junior scholar, at least what I as a junior scholar needed, which is some kind of validation, right? Some kind of psychological, like, yeah, I'm doing a good job, or I have a chance here, or like, what's going on, right? That's not the reviewer's job, right? If you have a very supportive committee, or ideally, like, friends and family who can provide that kind of psychological support for you, I think that's much better. But I'm just trying to give you the perspective of, I remember my first few very negative reviews, and they can be pretty crushing. Like, you haven't gotten, there's this kind of void in graduate school, right? You come in, you take a bunch of classes, you're learning a bunch of techniques, you've suddenly put yourself out there and did your first research project, and all the while you're getting very little feedback, right? Many people are making a transition from undergraduate to graduate school fairly quickly, and so we're used to getting grades or feedback on papers, and all of a sudden there's just like silence, or maybe if you're lucky you meet with your advisor once a week or once every few weeks, or you get a lot of emails back and forth. But a lot of people don't even get that. And then all of a sudden, you've submitted this paper and you just get really, really harsh negative comments, right? So I understand how that can have kind of a crushing, feeling, but my overarching advice for publishing is to learn to detach yourself from the thing that you are writing, right? You are understandably looking for signs that you are among the chosen who can come into academia and get a tenure track job or whatever, or get a job at industry or corporate company A, B, or C, or nonprofit X, Y, or Z, right? That's your goal, right? And you're looking for signs that what you're doing is working and you just have to keep doing it, right? And it becomes all about you, right? And are you doing the right things? Are you as a person smart, capable, hardworking, and so on and so forth? That is the wrong attitude in my view. The right attitude is, this is a paper. I'm a person. I produced a paper, right? My paper might have problems. My paper might have a lot of problems, but that is not necessarily, obviously there's a relationship there. I'm the person who made the paper, but the more that you can detach yourself from the paper, and once you do that, you realize a paper can be improved. There can be another study, right? People may have different types of reactions to papers. They're not reacting to me necessarily, they're reacting to the paper, right? And then you sort of detach your sense of self-worth and value from the paper, and you can, I think this is just a much more, it's psychologically valuable to preserve your sense of self-worth and find self-worth in other places, but two, it makes your job a lot easier because you can think of reviews as a set of things that you need to do to get the paper published. You may notice, this is sort of a funny thing I've noticed over the years, like, have you ever noticed how early on in graduate school, a lot of people will say things like, well, my master's thesis does this, or my dissertation is going to do Y. And then if you look at like senior graduate students, they start saying the dissertation does X. Have you ever noticed that? I always thought that was weird. Like, it's your dissertation, it's not the dissertation. And I started to realize that is this psychological metamorphosis, right? The dissertation is a thing, the paper is a thing, the manuscript is a thing, and people, sort of over the course of their career, increasingly detach themselves. That's also good for science, right? Because if you're too personally involved and your sense of self and ego is so attached to the work, you may get blinders about what actually makes the paper better. And that's why we have blind review, and so I'm not going to pretend that there isn't a lot of nastiness in the review process and that it can't be rough. But I'm trying to give you sort of some psychological resources to navigate the inevitable, which is rejections, and often sort of nasty rejections. Another thing I want to say, so we're sort of taking the reviewer's perspective, we're taking the editor's perspective here. I also want you to realize that it's non-trivial for the editor to find the reviewers. So if you're early on in your career, maybe you get your first review request, you're like, oh, this is cool. I finally get to do what I've heard about. I'm going to do a really good job. I remember that feeling like, oh, this is sort of a neat opportunity, right? That is the exception to the rule, right? More often than not, the editor sends out a review request, right? Maybe someone has suggested reviewers in the cover letter, or the online portal lets you suggest some reviewers, right? And you go there, maybe you go to one or two of those people. You probably don't go to all of them because there's a concern that those people might not be objective evaluators of the manuscript. And usually people suggest some of the most famous people you could think of, right, that get, these are the people getting dozens of requests a week, right? And those people, they might immediately say no because they're overburdened, especially if it's something they're not working on anymore. And we get our reputations are sort of weird, right? They're sticky. Like, for years I got review requests to do stuff on international migration, which I haven't written about since 2007. I still get those requests now, right? And I have to just say, like, I don't know anything about that field anymore. It's been like 10, 12 years. Even worse, these really busy, sort of more, famous or prestigious people might not even reply. Like they get hundreds of emails a day, and the journal request gets buried, or maybe it just got lost in the shuffle. And that's an even worse case scenario for the editor, because now you have this author, maybe it's a junior scholar trying to get a job, or someone trying to get tenure, or all these kinds of things. And now the process is taking much, much longer because you don't even know if someone is going to accept the request, right? So we're often sort of scrambling and trying to find people. It's even harder if I'm an editor at a place like Science, PNAS, where there's a fundamentally interdisciplinary audience, you know. At Science Advances, I used to get manuscripts from, you know, psychologists all the time. I'm not a psychologist, right? How do I know who to send the paper to? There's no like magical, there are databases of people, but, you know, by research interest, but I don't know the people. I don't know that they're qualified to do, so I have to go back and forth with, you know, other people. I have to, you know, sort of email sort of interlocutors. There's a lot of work going into just finding the reviewers in the first place. Incidentally, another reason why you might get bench rejected is an editor may be trying to find reviewers and can't get anybody to review it, and they take that as a signal that maybe this paper isn't so important, and so they do the sort of safer thing, which is to bench reject the paper and let it be someone else's problem, right? So I just want you to know all this because a lot of work is going in to even make peer review happen. Again, this is all largely unpaid. This is all volunteer, and we finally got the reviews. Okay. So, you know, you submitted your manuscript, you may wait anywhere from, and it's gone under review, you may wait anywhere from a couple of weeks to 6 to 8 months, right? Sometimes even 10 months. Social science journals in particular are pretty infamous for taking a really long time to review stuff. And again, that can be because of all the reasons I just described, like problems finding reviewers flake out, they say they're gonna review it and then they don't, and you thought you had 3 reviewers and now you have to send it out to another person who they themselves take a month, right? These are all the things going on behind the scenes while you know, our protagonist in this play is just sitting there thinking, where, you know, what's going on? Why can't I get a decision? I need to get a job, I need to get tenure, whatever it is, right? Another reason why you wanna have stuff under review all the time, or as much as you can, right? So that you're sort of spreading this time around to make sure that you can get a hit. You know, it's almost like you can think of it, it's sort of a bad, imperfect analogy, but sort of like fishing, right? You want to have like a line out there as often as you can if you're going to catch a fish. You're not going to catch a fish if you don't have a line out there. Okay. So we've gotten to the sort of decision phase. Lots of work has gone in to get us to this peer review space, and the reviewers have written their anonymous comments. Something I didn't realize when I first started publishing that I want you to know is that when you get the reviews, you know, usually get a decision letter, the editor says, please find the reviews enclosed, right? And they say, usually the most common outcome is rejection, right? We're all getting rejected all the time. Say, the reviewers didn't like your paper, they thought it had issue X, Y, and Z. Sorry that we can't publish your manuscript. We encourage you to send it somewhere else. You know, we think it might be a better fit at a, you know, more subfield journal or something like that, right? And then you see the text of the reviews. What you don't see is confidential comments that reviewers may send to the editor themselves. So there's usually, when you do a review, you'll see there's a box for comments to the authors and then comments to the editors. And you may say, you know, some nice things in the review, but in the comments to the editor, you may say, it could be something like, you know, I'm worried this research might have been, you know, plagiarized, or it could be something extremely bad, right? Or it could just be something like, you know, this manuscript is really well written, and I think it might eventually get published at a more, you know, less prestigious journal, but it just doesn't, you know, have strong enough evidence to make the claims that the person is saying, right? And so you then might get the reviews and say, oh, I got 3 really nice reviews. And remember, we're all in that motivated reasoning mode at this point, right? We want to know, we're looking for that sign of validation that somebody is saying, I'm doing it right, I'm taking the steps I need to take to succeed. And instead, you know, you're not seeing this sort of negative stuff, and you're seeing this positive stuff, and you're saying, or maybe you're sort of, you know, your brain goes straight to the positive stuff, and you're like, oh, I could have fixed that, or oh, you know, and why did they reject this? And this seems like a unfair decision, right? The problem, and this is, again, the goal today is to try to peel back the curtain and make this less opaque, right? There could be a lot of stuff going on that you didn't see, and that's fundamentally frustrating. But it's another reason to psychologically detach yourself from the paper, right? Someone somewhere had a negative reaction to your paper. It would be super useful if you could know exactly why it happened, but you can't, and you got to move on. Okay, so if you are So here we're sort of down, you've been rejected, you got these negative reviews, maybe there's positive reviews, maybe there's even 3 positive reviews and the editor rejected it. That's a particularly frustrating outcome, but again, we might not have seen everything. Let's say, probably the best possible decision you can get is a revise and resubmit. Very rarely, some editor might conditionally accept a manuscript saying, like, if you can do these 3 things, we're gonna publish your article. That's pretty rare, especially at very prestigious venues. Almost always there's a revise and resubmit. This, of course, is the editors telling you, we think your paper, it's really an endorsement. It's saying, we think your paper is good enough that it can be published provided you can address these problems. In the decision letter, the editor is going to give you some sense of what's going on, right? 3 of the reviewers all had the same issue with the manuscript. One of them really got into this point about methods, but we really don't want you to worry about that. We want you to worry about this problem. They're going to give you, ideally, the editor is going to give you a little bit of direction on how to proceed with the revision. But it's still your job to provide a point-by-point response to every single thing that comes up in the decision letter. So you respond directly to the editors, and you also respond directly to the reviewers. Very often, that whole manuscript is going to go back to everybody, the editors and the reviewers. Sometimes it's just going to go back to the editors. And that's important for you to know, because when it goes back to the reviewer, and your response to what the reviewer spent, volunteered their time to sort of observe about your paper and considers a major problem, and you maybe said something like, well, the editor didn't really care much about this, so I don't think this is really important. You're gonna elicit a negative reaction in that reviewer, right? Who, again, volunteered their valuable time to try to help this manuscript, and you didn't even listen to the criticism. That's a bad outcome. You really need to do the hard work of responding to each and every point. Sometimes you can address something, and even just doing that with a kind of dignity. Recognizing the value of the criticism and saying, you know what, this is a good point. We just can't do anything about it. In future work, we might try to address it. Obviously, make whatever response you can. But above all, be civil, be polite, and recognize again that a lot of work has gone in to get you these reviews. Okay, so then maybe you're spending weeks or months revising your paper to address these things, right? You're going to submit not only the aforementioned memo, but also a revised version of the manuscript. And there can be a lot of variation in how closely reviewers read the revised manuscript, read the memo, and so on and so forth. And so you really need to, in the memo, explain what you did in the manuscript, because you can't assume that someone's going to, remember, someone's already volunteered their time, they spent a few hours with your manuscript, and now, a month later, they've reviewed God knows how many manuscripts in between, and now here it comes back like a zombie from the dead, right? And you're like, oh, I don't even remember what this paper is about, and I got to get back in the headspace to remember what the issues were. Then I got to go read the other reviewers' comments and see whether what I'm doing is maybe, gelling with what they're saying or not. I might get a little bit of direction from the editor in terms of how to help, determine whether this thing should be published, but often not a lot, right? And so again, another round of work goes in. That then goes back to the editor. We can have multiple rounds of R&R. There can be new issues that come up. New reviewers can occasionally be brought in, especially if there's a dissensus among the existing reviewers that's common for another reviewer to come in. That can raise another series of issues, right? So this is a long process. A lot of articles from beginning to end, can take 2 or 3 years, especially in sociology, political science, economics. At the big journals like PNAS, Science, and so on, I would say you'd be pretty lucky if your manuscript was published in 3 months, 6 months, 12 months. And so, that means, again, remember, rejection is the norm, right? And each time you get rejected, this whole process starts over again, right? Another reason to keep things under review as long as possible. But let's say you got to that conditional acceptance. This is a huge deal, right? They're going to publish your manuscript. You maybe just have a few things you have to fix. And once you do that, you get an official acceptance. It goes to a copy editor. The copy editor's job is to make sure the manuscript is in line with the norms of the publication. They also might try to edit your manuscript to make it more readable. There could be other things you need to do, like some journals will ask you to write a press release or have a data release statement, or link to your pre-registration in a certain way if you've pre-registered your work, which we of course encourage you to do in the name of sort of open science. And then finally it comes out, and that can itself take months depending on the journal. So really long journey for each article. It's sort of like you can think of it as like a really lame version of the TV show Survivor, right? Like, who's going to make it all the right way? Like, nobody wants to see that. But that's where we're at. That's the name of the game, and it can be tedious, but it's important to know where to start. Okay, so we've now seen the process, like once the manuscript is submitted, but let's step back for a minute and actually talk about something that very few people talk about not just in computational social science, but in academia in general, and that's how do you learn to write? There's this wonderful book that was published some time ago. I think it was like 15 or 20 years ago, and the title of the book is How to Publish a Journal Article in 30 Days. And it sounds like a self-help book, It's like, and I have copies in my office which I give to students often because I find it to be such a valuable book for a lot of reasons. But one of the things I like most about the book is the quote that it starts out with. And the quote is this: writing in academia is a lot like sex in Victorian England. Everybody's doing it, but nobody's talking about it, right? And that's important, right? Because it means that we are, the hardest thing we have to do, the writing, nobody's teaching you how to do, right? Now, again, hopefully you have supportive mentors and advisors who are sitting down with you and sort of helping you learn the craft, right? You're spending a lot of time looking at some kind of laptop here. But I also want to, a huge important thing in this area is don't spend time alone with just your laptop, right? That's not the way to learn to write, Don't just stare at a blank Word document. That's what everybody sort of thinks, that like writing is this very personal, people don't like other people to read their writing. It's uncomfortable, right? It's like a very personal thing to write something in a lot of ways. And what a lot of people learn far too late is that writing is a profoundly collective process. Sharing your ideas with other people, getting feedback, learning how other people react when you say things in different ways. That's why presenting stuff at workshops and presenting stuff at conferences is so important, right? You're not just seeing whether the research is good. You're learning how people react to the research the way that you are talking about it too, right? Writing, again, is something that we all sort of, there's no like real guidebook, right? It's something we all have our own process for learning, but the number one mistake I think people make is to try to teach themselves, right? Why should you learn how to do this extremely esoteric thing, which is navigate the Byzantine world of academic publishing, which is so opaque, and nobody ever gives, or people very rarely give lectures like this, right? You're just supposed to sort of figure it out on your own, right? No, like talk to as many people as you can, talk to older graduate students, talk to postdocs, talk to junior faculty, talk to senior faculty, talk. That's one of my first and most important recommendations for learning how to write. The second, let's imagine, okay, I'm getting into some weird analogies today, but let's imagine, it's like the Middle Ages, and you want to be a blacksmith, right? Are you going to I don't know, go find some rocks and smash them and start up a fire and try to figure it out yourself? No, right? You're gonna be an apprentice. You're gonna learn from someone who knows what they're doing, right? In writing, we do this weird thing, which is we kind of go off into the wilderness, smash a rock, and try to make a sword. This is a really weird analogy. Sorry, I don't know where this is going really, but right, and it's almost like it's supposed to be this sort of like liminal experience where we suddenly can make swords, right? You need an apprenticeship. We are in a weird way like craftspeople, I think that's what term I want. Like we are, we need to learn in groups. And so like the very best way to learn how to write, I think, is to sit down with someone else and write together. This can be an advisor, this could be a co-author who's maybe got some more seniority. Watch their process. Like don't just, see what they're writing, but see like I learned from sitting down with my advisor, who's a brilliant writer, she would just like brain dump on the page in a way that made me like uncomfortable, frankly. I was like, oh my God, there's just words going down. I don't know where these are going, and they're not well written, and they're just going everywhere. And I was just like, what is she doing? And I kept wanting to interject and say, you spelled that wrong, or like, here's a better phrasing. And what I didn't realize is that was a part of the process. I was learning something at the time, right? I was learning how to brain dump. I was learning how to structure writing. I still do that today. I mimic her style almost automatically. And of course, I didn't realize it at the time that I was learning a process, not just a skill. But in retrospect, that was really valuable time. So sit and write with other people to learn how to write. You can learn, another way, of course, you can learn to write is by reading others. We spend a lot of time reading. It's what we do. But the reason why there's sort of limited utility in trying to learn by reading is that when we see an article, right, we just saw how much goes into publishing an article, right? How much it's been changed by the time we actually see it as readers, right? We don't get to peel back the curtain and see draft 1.0 of that paper. If we did, we might be very surprised at how different it can be, right? Depending on the field, right? Sometimes things are more linear in some fields and less linear in others, or more deductive in some fields and more inductive in others. But usually there's a lot of difference between that first submission and the final manuscript. And now we're going to try to perform that final manuscript ourselves, again, with very little training or experience, right? That's sort of a silly thing to do, right? Obviously, when you're trying to publish in a journal, you should pull a few articles and see the styles, everything from the reference format to what are they talking about in the third sentence of the introduction versus the third sentence of the methods section. How much detail do they go into the methods section versus an appendix? You can absorb all this by reading, right? And you can sort of learn from other people giving you feedback. So you definitely do that. But my overarching advice here, again, is to don't learn to write alone. Okay, so we're going to wrap up this lecture with another really important topic. Where should I submit my manuscript? So you spent a long time writing, you've done the research, you're probably years in at this point, and there's this important question, where do I submit my manuscript, right? How do I fast track it to the most prestigious journals in the world, right? That's the dream scenario, right? That everybody sends their first publication to Science and Science begs them to publish it, right? No, right? It's a crazy thing we do to think of the step back. I remember thinking one of the first times I submitted to one of these journals, who am I to even, as a junior scholar, you might feel like, who am I to even try, right? This is people can go their whole career without even publishing in these places. Why should I, the conceit really, how am I so important that the very best journals in the world, which may have, acceptance rates less than 6%, and that 6%, most of the stuff getting sent there is pretty good in the first place, right? So this is really the creme de la creme de la creme, right? Why should I submit there? I'll tell you a story. So first I'll tell you, this is a hard thing to do, right? Figuring out where your manuscript fits is really tricky. For everyone who says, oh, this manuscript has no shot in the dark at a place like this, there's an exception, right? I'll tell you from my own personal experience, I'm gonna talk a little bit more about my early years in graduate school. I'd spent 3 years writing a sort of master's dissertation kind of thing. And at the time, and I'm sure this is still true for most of you, you want to publish that thing that you spent a few years on, but it's bad, right? It was your first attempt at research, right? Mistakes were made, things didn't go as planned. And oh, by the way, you spent the last 2 years hearing about why it's terrible from everybody, right? And meanwhile, you've been learning all the ways to criticize an article, right? So you are down on this paper, right? You are just get this away from me. I don't want anything to do. It's got so many problems. I just need to move on to the next thing, right? Wrong. You need to get that thing under review, and I'll tell you a story. This is, so here I am, I think in my 3rd year of graduate school. Maybe I was in my 2nd year of graduate school. I just finished my master's thesis. My graduate program had this awful, but also pretty amazing program where you would sort of invite a senior scholar to come visit the university, and they would also give you comments on a presentation of your own work, which is sort of like, it's like, that's pretty amazing. Like, that's an extreme privilege in terms of graduate school, right, to be able to do that. So I invited my then hero at the time, who proceeded to just completely destroy my paper in what seemed like, just totally devastating way. And I was so down. I remember, even thinking about dropping out of graduate school. I was just down. I was just really, really bummed. And 2 weeks later, I was in another professor's office, and the professor said, "Oh, so-and-so really liked your paper." And I was like, "That's patronizing, because you just like tore it to shreds in front of like public humiliation." Basically, he's like, "No, seriously, he likes it," and he listed all these reasons why I liked it. And like, I was like, "What? Like, how did that? Well, why? Like, why was he so mean?" That was a lesson for me, because I learned that's a sign of respect, right? Like, we criticize each other. And again, when we get older, we forget this too, right? That this is part of the process, that this sometimes savage but very honest criticism is necessary for science to progress, right? And so and we're busy, and we don't always have the time to deliver it with enough care and attention to this, to be sensitive to the position of people just starting out. But I mentioned this story to tell you, like, even if you think your research has a million problems, you should still try to publish it. Let me finish the story about that paper. Okay, so this other professor sort of got me, okay, maybe it's not the worst paper ever, but I still didn't want to submit it. I was like, still has all these problems that I can't fix, right? Then a week later, I'm in my advisor's office, and she says something like, "Did you submit that paper yet?" And I was like, "It has this problem, it has that problem." She's like, "Go submit that paper." And I say, yeah, okay, I'll do it. And like 2 weeks later, I'm back in her office. She's like, "You didn't submit the paper, did you?" And I say, "No." She's like, "Go send that to American Sociological Review." And I'm like, "Okay, you just said the hardest journal to publish in my field. Like, this is like my dream publication. I don't even want to send it anywhere. You're telling me to send it to this very good journal." Finally, she convinced me to do it. Months later, I was like, almost as surprised as I've ever been in my whole life to see that I got an R&R, right? I almost didn't even send it, right? So it's a tricky thing here, right? You shouldn't send stuff that lots of people are telling you has no shot in the dark at these places, because it's actually in your interest to get the thing published eventually. And if it spends a lot of time, like let's say you do, was this 7 submissions and all of these rejected or bench rejected, and each time you're reformatting stuff, that's wasted time. But if you're getting the signal that this has a shot, you're not going to publish 100% of what you don't submit, right? So you gotta try. You gotta put yourself out there, and it's a hard thing to do. And I mentioned my humiliating experiences that are ultimately like nice stories to show you just how much these things can be sort of counterintuitive. Okay, so these are like the elite. Most of us will never even be able to publish in these places. It's really, really hard to publish in these places. So, we expect rejection, right? I still expect rejection for these places. I don't think other people would be so honest, but I think probably most people expect rejection for these places because it's 6%, right? And you're competing with the very best scientists in the entire world in our field. So rejection is almost a certainty at these places. And so, if you get rejected, or maybe you get the advice not to send it there, there's still a ton of really great places to publish your work that could be really advantageous in getting a job, getting tenure, getting a job in industry, getting a job in a nonprofit. We have new journals, Journal of Computational Social Science. We have disciplinary specific journals that are these are sociological science and political analysis are very good journals in sociology and political science respectively, but they're publishing a lot of research in computational social science, EPJ data science. The Journal of Quantitative Description is a really interesting new journal that only publishes, just like it sounds, quantitative descriptive work, a lot of which is computational social science. So there's a lot of interesting places, and the publishing ecosystem is really opening up a lot now. There's a lot more open source, or sort of open science venues. PNAS now has PNAS Nexus, Science now has Science Advances, Nature now has Nature Human Behavior. And those are, again, very elite venues that are hard to publish in, but there's parallels in a lot of other sort of less prestigious places. So check them out. Getting things published, getting that paper that you've grown to hate under review and eventually published is one of the most important things you can do in publishing in computational social science. And I just want to leave you with a few takeaways. The first is don't do it all alone. Don't go it alone, right? One of the reasons we do things like the Summer Institutes in Computational Social Science is to remind you that science, and especially computational social science, is a collective endeavor, right? We are all helping each other all the time. Science survives because of that generosity. That's why we try to incubate it here. So don't go it alone. The second main takeaway I would love for you to take away from this lecture is endurance. I've talked a lot about my advisor this morning. She's a very, very brilliant person, so I'll leave you with the last piece of advice that I tell my grad students, will tell you I tell it to them all the time. Success in academia is 5% creativity and 95% endurance. That's not what I signed up for. When I went to graduate, I was the life of the mind, supposed to be creative, right? And I'm supposed to be up there sharing my brilliance with the world, right? But in the end, it really is, having a good motor and a good psychological orientation vis-a-vis publishing, right? Again, distancing yourself from the paper. The paper is a thing that you wrote, but it doesn't mean that you are a good or a bad scholar necessarily. It's an object that you may be able to approve. Make that metamorphosis, and it makes it even easier to keep the endurance going, right? If the paper has problems, write another paper. Try to fix the problems, right? Don't dwell on them. Don't personalize things. Think of yourself as clocking in. That one other real challenge of what we do is there's no boundaries, right? You could suddenly find yourself working all weekend. That's not great, right? That's a lot of people would say that's no way to live, right? But we do it. We do it because we care about science. We care about research. We might love it, and we're willing to make sacrifices like that sometimes. So remember that even rejection is progress. Keep submitting and learn by doing. Do it with other people, and that's my advice for publishing in computational social science. Thank you. Hey, I hope you enjoyed this video on how to publish an article in computational social science. And I want to leave you with a few key takeaways from what we discussed in this video. The first is that sort of endurance wins the day. Publishing is hard. If it were easy, we'd all be published authors. And hopefully some of the tips I've given you today have taught you that it's not just a random process. It really is at the end of the day about endurance and about learning the craft of writing an article. So hopefully you've learned some stuff about that today, and I look forward to seeing you in other videos.